Hey everybody, Tim Albrick here, and thank you for listening to the YFP podcast, where each week we strive to inspire and encourage you on your path towards achieving financial freedom. This week, Nate Hedrick, the Real Estate RPh, joins the show to talk about the Pharmacist Playbook to buying their first home. We discuss 6 key steps to the home buying process, including how to determine if you're ready to buy, how to get clear on what is most important in the home purchase, key individuals to have on your home buying team, factors to consider when choosing a loan, what is and is not negotiable in today's market, and what to know when it comes to inspections, insurance, and closing. Let's hear a brief message from today's sponsor, the Real Estate RPh, and then we'll jump into the show. Are you planning to buy a home in the next year or two? With the state of current home prices and mortgage rates, the home buying process can feel overwhelming. But what if you could leverage the knowledge and ongoing support of someone who has worked with dozens of other pharmacists through their home buying journey, all at no cost to you? I'm talking about Nate Hedrick at the Real Estate RPh. Nate is a pharmacist who has been a partner of YFP for many years now and offers a home buying concierge service that can help you find a high quality agent in your area and support you throughout the entire process. So head on over to realestaterph.com or click on the link in the show notes to schedule your free 30-minute jumpstart planning session with Nate. Nate, welcome back to the show.
Hey, Tim, always good to be here.
So you are fresh off a trip to Iceland. Give us the good detail. How did that came to be, and what was the trip like?
Yeah, man, the land of fire and ice. It was really cool. So the short version of a long backstory is that my oldest daughter, for one of her goals this year, we do goals at the beginning of every year, and one of her goals was to go visit a foreign country. And so we were quickly informed by her that Canada doesn't count. So we had to find an alternative. So we took her to the library, checked out a bunch of books, and tried to weigh the budget options with her. And anyway,
Yeah.
she's focusing on Iceland, and we made it happen just last week, and it was really cool. It was a place unlike anywhere else I've ever visited. The landscapes there are just so unique. The travel there is just very, very different, but it was really cool, very worthwhile trip. So
You and I were talking before we hit record of how cool of a first experience that is from international travel, right? It's different enough, but there's still some bridges where the kids can be comfortable and things. So that's great. Love that. And as our listeners know, we talk so often about this balance between taking care of the future and living a rich life today. What a cool example of that, Nate, and bringing the family into that. So I love that.
thanks. Yeah, we had a really good time.
So perhaps while you were there, or maybe on the flight home, back in the U.S., we saw interest rates drop here recently. I think the lowest they've been in a handful of months. And
Mhm.
what are you seeing in terms of the impact on that rate drop? Something we've been anxiously awaiting, and how that would shake out in terms of all the people that are on the sidelines waiting to buy a home.
Yeah, I haven't seen dramatic changes. In fact, I've still seen parts of our market that are still relatively slow. I think what's interesting about the rates in general is they don't tend to affect the day to day. I think they sort of affect these trends and these movements. But without things changing, 2.5% overnight, you're not going to see all of a sudden everybody showing up to the bank for an application. I saw a stat floated around this morning, something to the effect of, even though rates are 1% lower than they were just a year ago, mortgage application rates are still down 8 or
Mm.
10%.
Hmm.
So I think, there's some movement out there, there's some improvement, but we're not at a level where people are going to refinance yet. We're not at a level where it's so good that it's, beating inflation or anything like that. And I just think that people are slower to react even as these rates start to get a little bit better.
Yeah, I'm really curious to see kind of where that goes. And as we've talked about many times on the show before, there's a lot of interested buyers out there, and I think a lot of people that are itching to get into a home, and we'll see where the rate trends continue to go, and we'll bring you back to make sure we've got the most up to date information for our listeners. So I think that's relevant to our discussion today because, as I mentioned, there's pent up demand, there's interest rates. I feel like there's a lot of first time pharmacist home buyers that are out there, and they've been kind of stacking right on top of one another for the last few years. And so today's focus is we want to go through a step-by-step guide, step-by-step playbook, if you will, to buying your first home. We're going to discuss how to determine whether or not you're ready, factors to consider prior to beginning the home search, how to select the home loan option that's the best for you, and ultimately what are those costs that are involved in buying a home, and what can and cannot be negotiated in today's market. So Nate, before we get into those specifics, let's talk about the benefits of home ownership, because given the housing market that's out there right now, a lot of people are questioning whether or not it makes sense to buy a home. And I think the rent versus buy question is getting some renewed energy for good reason. So how are you thinking about the rent versus buy decision, the rent versus buy calculation in today's market, and someone making that decision, of course, knowing that every market is different?
Yeah, it's always been a question, right? No matter what the market looks like, even when rates were crazy low, even when 2021, when home buying was at just an absolute fervor,
Yeah.
it's always a question. Like, is it better to wait? Is it better to buy now? A lot of it has to do with how stable are you looking for? How long are you going to be in that
Mhm.
particular property? If you're in a location for a year and you're doing your residency there and you're planning on moving out after that, it's probably never going to make sense to try to beat the market, quote unquote, by buying a house, selling it, hoping for the best. Like,
Mhm.
you might make out, it might be okay. But in almost all those cases, renting is probably going to be preferred. Now, as you move that timeline out a bit further, if you're going to keep that property and rent it out, let's say, or you're going to move to a location that you hope to find a long term job, that conversation starts to shift. And it starts to
Mhm.
become a conversation of, well, how much do I have to put down? What are closing costs? What are all the factors that go into this upfront fees, and what is that going to look like in terms of what I could rent this for? Because as we've said, rates are better; they're still high, but rents have been going up too. So
Yeah,
you're
exactly.
factoring into a lot of different pieces when making that decision.
Yeah, and you and I covered this. Gosh, it's probably been 3, 4, 5, 6 years ago now. I'm not. I'd have to go back and look what episode it was, but
Making me feel
actually
old.
getting into the weeds on that rent versus buy, very different market, of course, than what we're looking at today. But
Mhm.
one of the resources we talked about in that episode, we'll link to it in the show notes again, is the New York Times has a pretty cool rent versus
Mhm.
buy calculator that really helps avoid that trap of I'm paying X for rent and the mortgage payment is Y, and comparing those. Right, there's a whole another layer of costs and things that
Yep.
we want to really evaluate to determine what's the apples to apples, right? Or as close as we possibly can get. So again, we'll link to that in the show notes. So Nate, let's jump into our 6 steps for first-time home buyers, the playbook for first-time home buyers. And if listeners want to follow along and take notes, you can download our free YFP first-time home buying quick start guide. And you can get that by going to yourfinancialpharmacist.com/home guide. That's all one word. We'll link to that in the show notes as well. So, Nate, step number one is making sure that you're ready, building on the conversation that we've already started. And buying a home can be a great move, but you got to be in the right position. And that really starts with knowing your budget and considering how the home purchase fits as a piece of the broader financial puzzle that accounts for other goals such as student loan debt. Of course, very common among first time home buyers, making sure we've got the right reserves and emergency funds. How do we get started with investing in retirement savings? We have all these things that we have to consider. And of course, the home, albeit a big one, is one of many different aspects of the financial plan. So tell us from your experience as a first time home buyer, it's been a while, and coaching many first time home buyers through the process, how the buyer and the bank really answer this affordability question.
Yeah, and I was just thinking it's actually going to be 10 years since first time home buyer status, just like this month. So,
Woo.
yeah, it's been a minute, but I think this is probably the most boring part of this six-step guide, right? But it's arguably the most important. And I think people are like, "Oh, skip it, budget, don't want to look at it." But I can't tell you how many I meet with somebody every week and talk about this
Mhm.
stuff where if you don't set yourselves up for success, if you just jump into Zillow and say, I need a 4 bedroom house and I already live in Cleveland, Ohio, beautiful sunny day here in Cleveland,
Mhm.
like, this is what the house is going to cost. Rather than doing that, actually taking a step back and spending 30 minutes to figure out what your budget actually looks like can go so far in terms of the long-term affordability and giving you flexibility down the road. One of the things that, again, we lucked into, because again, 10 years ago, I had no idea what I was doing. We bought a house that was, less than max, right? We way
Mhm.
undercut what we could have possibly spent on a house. And now we're still in that same house 10 years later and couldn't be happier because we've got this nice reasonable payment. So even as Chris and I have cut back a little bit on work or taking trips to Iceland, the housing is so much more affordable. And I can't tell you the number of pharmacists that I've talked to that didn't luck into that, right? Or went the opposite
Mhm.
direction and said, I'm going to spend as much as I can. I want this big, nice house. And then they're paying for it later and it becomes
Yeah.
problematic. So it's something I really encourage people to do. Take a hard look at the numbers and it will benefit you in the long term.
I was thinking of Nate as you were talking, a webinar I did several months ago talking about budgeting. And as you said, right, we bring that topic forward and people are like, end episode, right? I don't want to talk about this anymore. But what was interesting is I had several pharmacists ask them to submit their budgets in advance that we would share anonymously if they were comfortable doing so. And I kind of analyzed them, talked through them. And to no surprise, one of the things that we saw is the percentage of income that was allocated to fixed costs very high, right? And
Mhm.
and the home,
Yeah.
of course, tends to be along with student loans, along with car payments, along with childcare costs, which is probably the big four as
Yep.
I see them. But when you're talking about a 30-year decision that for most people is a fixed payment, outside of some of the taxes and other things that will increase over time, like we're locking in a big piece of the financial puzzle,
Yep.
right? And so easier said than done in today's market. Totally get it. But we want to make sure that we're not putting ourselves in a situation where we're looking up a year or 2 years later saying, hey, I make a great income, but I don't feel like I'm progressing because one of those big reasons at least being that home purchase.
Yeah, I think that's spot on, and I think that it's again, it's very easy to sit here and say, right? It's easy to say, "Look at the budget,
Absolutely.
don't spend too much." But then again, I can't tell you the number of people I've talked to where they look in their market and the only option is to spend 35% of their income on a house for them. Like
Mhm.
they need 3 bedrooms is all that's going to fit. So I think it's a lot easier said than done, but you have to at least have a wrangle on those numbers so that you can start making an informed decision rather than just jumping in and hoping for the best later on.
Yeah. Yeah. And to your point, if that is what it is in the market, like what else can we be doing in the financial plan to make some shifts or adjustment, knowing that, hey, that's just going to be a big part? Because you and I both know that pharmacists' salaries don't adjust necessarily with cost of living proportionally, right?
100%. I mean,
Um,
that's one of the risks.
I think this making sure you're ready portion also includes we're in looking at all costs of the
Mm,
mortgage, right? Nate, I think my experience personally going through this and talking with many pharmacists is most folks are probably thinking about what's referred to as PITI, right? Principal, interest, taxes, insurance, but might stop there. What
mhm.
else should they be considering, both one time and ongoing costs when they're trying to answer this question? Am I ready?
Yeah, the big ones that I missed in terms of ongoing were the property taxes. So when I was a renter, I didn't really think about property taxes. I didn't have to pay property taxes. I knew they were a thing, but I didn't
Mhm.
really like factor that in. And often it's tucked into your mortgage. But what you don't realize is that those property taxes can go up, right? So those are going to be reassessed. In fact, here in Cuyahoga County, we just had our reassessment done, and everyone's property taxes increased. So even though I haven't sold my house in years, it still does go up over time and it tends to go up every year. So there are little things like that are easy to miss. Even something like utilities, for example, if you're a renter today and maybe utilities are baked into your rent, maybe it's even just a couple of utilities, maybe it's just gas or the
Mhm.
water and sewer bills. But all those are your responsibility now. And so if we had a really hot summer like this and our electric bills were through the roof because we're paying for the air conditioning, that comes with the territory of homeownership, and it's something that is difficult to calculate, but you have to kind of plan a little bit of buffer for those kind of things because now they're all your responsibility once you take on that homeownership.
Yeah, and those ongoing things to me are so important, right? Because when we talk about, fixed costs in the budget that we're
Mm.
going to try to move other pieces around, utility costs, you nailed it. Obviously, those have gone up, I think, across the board. Property taxes, I know for us here in the Columbus area, that's been huge. We actually have a commercial property, our office space up in northeast of the city. And we bought that property in 2021 and property taxes nearly doubled.
Jeez.
And so those are the things as an investor, you're thinking about, but you're not thinking
Mhm.
about doubling.
Right.
And great, the property value has doubled, but guess what? Like one is related to monthly cash flow, one is not, right?
Yep.
So at least in this moment. And then I think the homeowners insurance increases we're hearing about all across the
Mm.
country, Nate, are huge. I don't know if we felt it as much here in Ohio. I know we're hearing from people in Florida and other parts of the country that are more prone to natural disasters. They're seeing some more significant increases, but these are the things that we want to be thinking about, that breathing room, right? When we're making this decision about, hey, are we ready to purchase a home or not?
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. I mean, David and I just did an episode on the REI podcast about insurance, where we talked to
Hmm.
an insurance agent, and it's incredible to hear some of the stories around the country of carriers that are pulling out, carriers that are doubling policy costs. I mean, it's pretty incredible. So it's definitely those things are not something to ignore, and even if they're a little difficult to calculate, you have to at least plan for them.
Yeah, that's right. All right, number two on our list of six steps in the playbook for pharmacists as first-time home buyers is determining what's important. So once we make sure we're ready financially, it's really time to determine what's important. What do we want? What's top of the list? What's maybe a desire, but not at the top of the list? So, Nate, before we start the search, how do you think about narrowing down this list of the must-haves to a few key areas?
Yeah, and I think part of this is not just you personally knowing, but if you've got a spouse involved in the decision or you've got someone else involved in this process, it's
Hmm.
how do we all get on the same page, right? One of the things I'll often do with couples who are buying a house together is I'll send them both these must-have sheets and let them fill them out separately and then kind of come back
Oh, that's
together.
cool.
Yeah, it's neat and it's fun to see what they put on paper because a lot of this is like stuff you talk about, but when you're doing it separately and you have to like write it down and then it's like the newlywed game, right? You get to see what they actually write down. And you're like, wait, what you want that? I didn't realize how important that was to you. And so kind of assessing those things can really make a difference. And especially if you're taking a step and looking at all this stuff before you hit search and you
Hmm.
say, look, hey, we've got 4 kids. And so we need a 5 bedroom house or whatever the math works out to. That can drastically affect things like your budget or where you're able to buy. You
Hmm.
might not have 5 bedroom houses in the neighborhood that you want to look in, right? That might not be an option. You might have to build. You might have. So it really changes the dynamics of how you're going to search, and it affects a bunch of other things down the line. So again, if you're looking at, let's say you're looking at, you want area for your horses. We just rode horses in Iceland for the first time ever. And so if you're like, I need to have my Icelandic horse as part of my house property, right? That's a very different location, very different agent, very different financing.
Yeah.
All those decisions that play out after that change because of that decision of what is most important to you. So you have to have that kind of criteria established up front.
Yeah, and I think knowing what flexibility, Nate, exists or doesn't exist. So are
Mhm.
some things non-negotiable, right?
Yeah.
Maybe that's number of bedrooms, whereas other things you're like, hey, I'd love if we could have X, Y, or Z, the finished basement or a pool or a fenced in yard or whatever. But maybe it's not a hey, it has to, because I think that really helps with the agent relationship. We'll talk about that here in a little bit, and really making sure that person has the information they need, that they're not wasting their time or your time, setting a bunch of properties or going to visit a bunch of properties that ultimately, aren't the right fit.
Absolutely.
Speaking of agent, let's talk about number three on our list of six steps, which is assemble your team. Most first time home buyers, I think, start their search like I did, which was driving by properties, scrolling listings online. But sooner or later, they're going to have to assemble a team to pull the trigger and ensure one of the, if not the largest purchases they're going to make in their lifetime goes smoothly. So, Nate, talk to us about how the right team can make all the difference and who you're thinking about as key team members.
Yeah, I think this step always kind of feels overwhelming. Building a team sounds like a pretty serious endeavor, but what we're trying to say is that you're looking for individuals that are going to make the process easier and help you out. This doesn't have to be a big, long, drawn out process. You want to make sure that you've got people that know what they're doing to supplement, right? Just like you would on the team rounding in the hospital or working in the
Mhm.
pharmacy. You're not doing all this stuff by yourself. You don't have to know everything. You just have to have the experts in your corner. A lot of times that's going to start with something simple, either a lender or a real estate agent. Connecting with them, getting them to give you referrals to the other people that you might need, and then taking off and running from there. I do encourage people to interview whoever you're working with.
Mhm.
And we can, I've done webinars on this in the past where we go through like tips on interviewing an agent, for
Yep.
example, or tips on vetting an agent. But regardless, whoever you're working with, make sure you're interviewing them. This is somebody that's helping you make a huge decision. You want to have a good experience. And so spend the time to make sure that you're getting somebody really high quality and somebody that you're going to be able to work with well.
Yeah, I think great advice. And again, this is something we don't want to haphazardly walk into. And referrals can be helpful, but your needs may be similar than someone else, different than someone else. So making sure you feel good about this decision and the people that are ultimately representing and working alongside of you. Nate, I think this would be a good place, just given the agent aspect here, to talk about some of the changes that we've talked about in the podcast before related
Mhm.
to the National Association of Realtors settlement. When we talked about it 3, 4, or 5 months ago, it was a hey, this is coming
Yeah.
in the end of the summer, and here we are. So now that the dust has maybe somewhat settled, like what is the impact that you're seeing?
Yeah, if you ask our brokerage, we're like in the middle of the dust because it just went live where these changes are now in effect. And so essentially what happened is that the National Association of Realtors was sued. They decided to settle without admitting any fault. And the big change that resulted from that settlement is one, they had to pay out a whole bunch of money, as is normal, but also they had to get rid of the buyer's commission that was advertised in the MLS.
Hmm.
So the way it worked up until a couple days ago is that if I was showing a house for a prospective buyer client, I knew that there was a 3% commission or a 2.5% commission that is being offered by the seller. And that when I write a contract, I'm going to get that as part of
Yep.
working with that buyer. That is no longer allowed. You cannot advertise that commission agreement. Basically, what is now required is that that commission has to be negotiated. It has to be a part of the buyer's contract. So it doesn't go away. It doesn't change necessarily. It's just the way that it's going to be talked about is very different, and it's going to be talked about up front. So if you're a
Hmm.
buyer and you're working with an agent for the first time, there's going to be a conversation about, hey, my job is to negotiate and work for you to help you guys find the best house. But as part of that, I need to get paid. And so there's going to have to be a number, call it 2%, 2.5%, 3%, whatever that is, in commission that I'm going to try to be getting from the seller. And we're going to agree to what that number is right now as a process of working with me. My goal is to get that from the seller, right? I'm going to write a purchase agreement to you, Tim, and I'm going to say the house is $200,000
Yep.
with a 3% commission for me. My goal is to get it from that seller, but there's a possibility they come back and say, I'll accept 200,000, but I'm not paying your agent
Yep.
anything. And then we have to figure out what we're going to do. And so that's where we are today, where that's sort of in limbo, and we're going to kind of see how the market plays it out. Uh, the likely options at that point are going to be either we write the contract for a bigger amount, we write it for
Yep.
200,000 plus 3%, and then you finance that, or the buyers are going to have to pay that 3% out of their own pocket. I think that's going to be not the norm. I think that's going to be the exception more than the rule. But there are a lot of changes, and we're sort of feeling out what this is going to look like as the time goes on.
And that last point you made, in terms of could this fall in the back of the buyer, right? I think that's what most of the listeners that are looking to buy
Right.
a home are wondering. And this is just such a stark change
Yes.
from, how we have thought about buying agents in the past. And, I had a conversation offline a couple of months ago of like, this really will, in my opinion, it's going to take time, but this really will start to differentiate the value that a buying agent is bringing. And I'm a firm believer, and I know this from working with you and talking with other agents, not all agents, just like not all financial planners are created equal. And when you think about the bar of entry into someone becoming a real estate agent, similar to someone else becoming a financial planner, like,
Mhm.
that bar of entry, there is one, but it's not incredibly
It's
high,
very
right?
low. Let's be
Very low.
honest, it's
Thank you.
very
You
low.
said
You
it.
can say
Okay.
it.
And so it really then comes down to like, hey, are you talking with an agent, working with one that has experience? Like,
Mhm.
how much experience and what has that experience been like? And so this is really going to flip that conversation. And I think for buyers is just so different. And I'm curious to know, it's so fresh right now, kind of how this shakes out. And in this market, Nate, that we're in, like that first option you mentioned where, hey, we'll write the contract and, we'll see if the listing person selling the home will ultimately pay it. Like, arguably we're in a seller's market, right? So do you see that happening, or what do you see happening short term?
I think yes is the short answer to your question. I mean, we're doing that essentially today, right? If you think about again, it's still that $200,000 house today. Right now, that 3% is coming from the seller already. So like that's not really changing. What I think this is going to do is going to provide a lot more transparency. Like you said, the barrier to entry on real estate is very low. And there were a lot of agents out there that would get their license, work with a buyer, knowing full well that it did not matter how good they were at their job. If they got someone to close, there was a guaranteed 2.5 or
Yeah.
3% sitting out there waiting to be theirs, right? And I think
Mhm.
the benefit of this change is that goes away. There's no
Yep.
guarantee. You have to actually prove your value as a buyer's agent now. And so I think that's going to help the market overall. I think it's going to be interesting to see how exactly it shakes out.
Yeah, and this would be a good stop that I just want to pause and we'll talk more at the end, but to
Mm,
put a plug, Nate, for you and what you're doing with your clients through the home buying concierge
mm.
service. People can learn more, realestaterph.com. We'll link to that as well as the site on YFP website. If you click on home buying on the homepage, you can get there. But you do offer value. Our listeners will get that from what we're talking about here, and you have the experience, and you've done it obviously yourself. You've done it with many clients locally. You've worked with agents all across the country. You've done this many times as an investor as well. And so I think finding that person, that relationship that's a good fit, now more than ever with these changes is going to be so important. So,
Yeah,
shout out to the work
especially
that you're doing.
I really appreciate that, Tim. And again, I think especially as more and more agents are going to require you to lock into a contract because that
Yeah.
guarantee is gone, you kind of have to get it right the first time, which sounds overwhelming, and I don't mean that to be like intimidating, but you kind of have to get this one right. And so, working with somebody that is the experience you're looking for, or being matched with somebody that we have vetted already, can be a huge difference maker if you're looking at buying a home for the first time, especially.
What do you think's gonna happen for the many people that are out there looking, who work with an agent but never actually go through with a purchase for whatever reason? I mean, is that like, will there be cost? I mean, there's obviously cost to your time and stuff that now we're looking at this relationship differently. Like, will that still be no charge to the prospective buyer? Or what do you think that will look like?
So I think there's going to be a lot of people that try to get creative. I have already seen, and this is like on LinkedIn, so I don't know how legit it is, but I've already seen some cases where someone will say, "Look, I charge $995. I'll show you up to 15 houses, and I'll negotiate one contract, and that's the cost to work with me, right? And whether you buy or not, I don't really care anymore." I think you'll see people start to get creative, but I think you'll see the market probably wants to keep things as close to as they are now. Um, so I think you'll see people just negotiate these contracts with their buyers directly,
Mhm.
and then try to get them to negotiate with the sellers to pay the cost.
Yeah, I actually know an agent here in the area that's doing kind of what you just shared, and I don't know how widespread it is, but on a per listing fee,
Mhm.
or it's like a higher flat fee. We'll get you so many 10, I forget what it was, 10, 15, 20. But if you want to do it kind of a la carte, it's per, type of
Interesting.
so I'm curious to see where that goes.
Yeah.
All right, let's talk about number 4, which is choosing a loan. Probably what many people are thinking about as a top priority. And before we talk about loan types, let's talk about pre-approvals,
Mhm.
especially important in the competitive market that we're in today. What is a pre-approval? Why is it necessary? And what items are needed to get to that point of having one?
Yep. So a pre-approval, plain and simple, is someone, well, typically a lender, giving you a letter that is going to say, "Hey, there is a person out there willing to lend to this individual for a certain amount of money." So if I go with a pre-approval letter to a seller and it says I'm pre-approved up to $250,000, that seller has confidence knowing that there's someone else out there behind me willing to basically front that money. So it's all that is saying that someone has basically vetted you, and agrees to basically to back that up. The common misconception is, well, I don't need that until I found a place, or I don't need that until
Hmm.
later. I actually just spoke with a potential buyer this past week, and she said, I said, "Are you pre-approved? Just want to get an idea." And she said, "I wasn't going to do that until I found the perfect house. Like, I don't want to waste my time and do that until then." Um, the risk there is that if you find the perfect house and there are 5 other people that think it's the perfect house and you're not pre-approved, you're not getting it, right? It's not going to be something that we would even consider as a seller. So you really want to have that letter in hand up front. It's a pretty simple process to get done, and it's good for typically 3 to 4 months, and it's
Yep.
really easy to renew. I renew mine all the time, even though we're not actively looking. It's just something to keep on hand. So
Hmm.
it's pretty simple, and something that everybody should be doing up front.
Yeah, and in order to get a pre-approval, you're going to have to make a case to the bank that you're a qualified lendee, right? So you're going to be providing paycheck information, assets, liabilities, kind of a snapshot of your overall financial picture. But to your point about, not waiting on the sidelines, like my experience is that takes time,
Yeah,
depending on the bank. It might take more or less time, and how nimble they can be. But to be able to get all that information, upload it, for them to make a decision on that, it's going to take time. So you want to have that in hand, especially given that that's good for a period of time.
definitely.
So once we get pre-approved and we're ready at that point, how we go about the loan selection choice is probably one of the biggest decisions that people are going to make in the process, and I think is confusing to navigate
Mhm.
given the differences that are out there and the products that are available, which can vary in terms of percent down payment that's required, minimum credit scores, whether or not there's private mortgage insurance or PMI. So talk to us about the common types of loans that are out there and the key features of those loans.
Yeah, I mean, this is such a broad topic. We could do 2 episodes just on loans. I mean, you've had Tony on the show enough times talking about loans, right? Like, this is such a big area of focus that, it's hard to cover it all, but the basics are this, right? You're going to have some sort of product, and that product is going to be backed up by the bank in some way. And they can back that up
Hmm.
through the government. They can back it up through like your job. They can back it up through federal programs, like you name it. There are ways for them to basically underwrite these loans,
Hmm.
and the qualifications within those underwritings are what determines things like your down payment, your interest rate, what houses you're available to buy, so on and so forth, right? So typically people are going to see one of three types, and again there are thousands of others, but typically you're
Hmm.
either going to have what's called an FHA loan, or government backed loan, a conventional loan, which is sort of like your standard 30-year fixed rate loan, or you're going to see like a pharmacist home loan or a doctor's loan.
Hmm.
That's typical to our audience. And so any one of those have different pros and cons, different down payments, different interest rates, different terms, so on and so forth. But all of those are pretty viable and are going to be pretty common for most people.
Yeah, did you mention, we'll link in the show notes. We've talked about, this at nauseum in terms of the options that are available. But this is huge. I talked with a pharmacist, Nate, last week that's out in California. I want to say it was in the San Francisco area, that is looking to purchase a home 12 to 24 months now. I asked a budget question,
Mhm.
right? And I'm like holding my breath. It's California. So, it was, hey, about $800,000. And then I asked the loan question, like, hey,
Mhm.
what are you thinking in terms of lending? No clue, and no fault to
Yeah.
their own. There's just, not yet there in the
Mhm.
process. But I was trying to really encourage them, like, start to dig in, because when you're talking about an $800,000 home and qualifying, and what a 3% or a 10% or a 20% on a conventional down payment, we're talking about either a ton of cash or still a ton of cash, but not as much cash, right?
Exactly.
And how that fits in with, hey, your student loans and all these other things that we're trying to achieve. So this again is big, and probably for first time home buyers, that down payment piece comes to front and center, because right, they're focused on many other goals, student loans, et cetera, that we've been talking about, and really making sure that you feel comfortable with the product. And if you're putting less down, or you giving up on anything on rate or terms or other things, you got to look at the whole picture before you make a decision.
Yeah, all good points and all things that are difficult and overwhelming to consider at times.
Yeah.
Again, one of the ways that you can sort of make this a little easier is start to talk with your agent about this. If you start with an agent, if you if you have no idea where to start with a lender, start with an agent and they'll be able to refer you to a couple of good agents. I can usually parse out, even though I'm not a lender, I can usually parse out like, hey, it seems like you're looking for lowest down payment options, or you're all about monthly payments. So these are the people that I'm going to start directing you toward. Then you can refer them to three different lenders that they
Yeah.
can have a meaningful conversation with, rather than starting from scratch and just Googling, local lender near me.
Hmm.
So that's a good way to get started if someone doesn't know where to start.
Good stuff. All right. Number 5 on our list is find your home and negotiate. So at this point, we've determined what's in the budget. We've narrowed down the list of must haves. We've assembled our team. We've gotten pre approved with the lender. We know the product we're going to be pursuing. So now it's time to get serious with looking, right? So talk to us about what's involved in this step. And especially in today's market, like,
Mhm.
what is the reality of negotiation?
Yeah, usually this is where people start, right? This is step number one is
Right.
find your home. Like open Zillow, look for your favorite house. So it's funny that we're waiting all the way to number five to get there, but it shows the importance of the prep work, right? Because it's how you're going to do this successfully.
Hmm.
So right now there are a lot of ways to search for homes, right? You've got Zillow, Realtor.com, you've got Facebook Marketplace, the MLS, which is where realtors are posting their sites. All of those are great options, and really there's no wrong answer. I think the thing to keep in mind is that there's sometimes a preconceived notion that if I'm working with an agent, they're going to go find me a house, right? They're going to find me a property. With the way things are set up today, with the automatic emails that you can get, with
Hmm.
the notifications you can set on Zillow and Realtor and all those, it's typically much easier to set criteria yourself or give those criteria to an agent and allow them to build you an automatic email that's going to be
Hmm.
looking for the houses that might fit your criteria, and then you be the one to decide, does this make sense? So I think that's something to kind of just put in people's heads, because I've talked to some out there where it's like, well, the agent, is trying to find me a house, but I'm not having much luck. It's like, well,
Hmm.
be involved as well, because they can do a lot, but you can often do just as much with some of the tools that are out there today. So that's kind of part one. Part two is to try to keep your criteria in mind, right? We did all these steps 1 through 4 up front for a reason.
Hmm.
It is very easy to, if you've got a $300,000 budget, to fall in love with a $500,000 house,
Hmm.
right? Really try to restrict yourself from doing that. because it's just going to cause heartache, right? It's much easier to start to stick within your parameters and roll from there. So those are just some kind of key tips when you get started with the process. When you're actually looking at homes, that's when, kind of the rubber meets the road, where you're going to be doing the bulk of the legwork to see, do I see myself living here? Uh, is this actually meeting the criteria that I was expecting? Does this match the pictures? Is it matching the things I'm seeing online and so forth? And then relying on your agent and eventually an inspector to help with things like, is this a problem, or are
Yeah.
we worried about X, Y, and Z?
Makes sense. And I think what's challenging this a little bit right now is, we've seen in our area, I'm sure all across the country as well, is, in terms of the competitiveness of the market,
Mhm.
cash buyers that are out there, appraisal gap waivers that are happening, lots of things that are competing with people trying to purchase a home is, you might set that budget at the very beginning at 300, even if you hold the line and you got the filter criteria at 300. Right, there could be that home maybe goes at asking, slightly below, maybe depending on the market, perhaps above it, right? And some other cash that's needed to close it well. So every market, of course, different, but I think it's hard right now, just given where it is, and I think all the pent up demand to really hold tight to that budget.
Yeah, and you mentioned it perfectly. It's very market specific. We have areas here where that, over asking isn't happening anymore, and other areas
Yeah.
where every house that pops up, I don't care how badly they take the pictures, it's flying over asking price, right? So it depends pretty heavily on the market and the location.
And that's within Cleveland, you're talking about, like, different communities within the area?
Even here within Cleveland, yep, for sure.
Yeah, that's interesting. All right, number 6, last on our list, Nate, inspect, insure, and close. So we're under contract. It feels like we finally have crossed the finish line, given the steps that we've covered up until this point. But there's some more important details remaining that are in between the accepted offer and the keys in hand. That being the inspection, consideration for a home warranty, and closing. Tell us more.
So I always say this to my clients, that there's two parts of buying a home that feel scary. And part one is putting in an offer, because it feels very final. It feels
Hmm.
like once I put this in, like that's it. But the reality is that the second part, when you waive inspection contingencies, that's the actual like serious scary part, right? Because that's when your earnest money goes solid, and you can't get it back. That's
Hmm.
when essentially you are buying that house. So there's a period in there, that inspection window, that you have a chance to do some really good due diligence. Usually it's 7 or 10 days if you've negotiated
Hmm.
that in. Hopefully your agent is helping you do that. And during that time, it's really your moment to figure out, does this actually work, right? Are there things in the house that we're worried about, right? Is the roof caving in? Is there water damage in the
Hmm.
basement? Is there, properties going up nearby that we're concerned about? All of those pieces are pieces you want to be spending time to do that due diligence on, because there's going to reach a time where that it's too late to really do that stuff down the road. So it's the moment to get all those things figured out. And again, you mentioned insurance in there. There's also a piece of like, contact your insurance agent and figure out what your costs are going to be for this specific house. That's
Yes.
still part of your due diligence. And
Hmm.
so many people I talk to wait until the very end to do this insurance piece. And then they find out, oh, well, it's got an old electrical system. And actually, the
Hmm.
roof is 20 years old and they won't insure it. Or,
In a flood area,
yeah, or
or
it's in a
yeah.
floodplain, or I
Hmm.
mean, you name it, right? So do that due diligence during the time period that you've got, because it's super important, and it really is the actual last thing before the scary step of waiving everything.
That's what made me so nervous about the period of time that we're in, and I'm guessing there's still some of this out there of waiving inspection.
Yeah.
Is to your point, in a traditional process, you've got point one, and then you've got a later point, right? So you've got a little bit of time to sleep on it, do some due diligence, take a breath. Look at the inspection report, make sure you feel good about costs and things that are needed repairs. Like when that inspection's being waived, that's bang bang
Yep.
right at that point. So, are you still seeing that out there much?
Some, not here in the Cleveland market as much. I haven't had a wave of inspections in ages,
Okay.
personally, but I know it's still common out there. There's a question I get all the time, Tim. It's Nate, is now still a good time to buy a house? And I've literally gotten that question my entire career of real estate, which I think is funny. But the only time I say no to that question, quite honestly, is if you're in a market that is still in that sort of a fervor, where you are waiving
Mm.
inspections, you are waiving everything, because it doesn't give you that pause button. Like I think it's really, really scary to go into a house purchase not knowing all the information and trying to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars. I just
Especially as the first time.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Mhm.
Even on things like new builds where, they're like, "Oh, it's a new construction. Don't worry about it." Like, there are just as many problems with new builds as there are
Yeah.
with existing construction. So, it's there's never a blanket answer for everything, but be worried, I suppose, if you're in a market where that's the norm and then everything's being
Mhm.
waived, then you kind of have to just hope for the best. I don't like those personally.
So there you have it, the 6 steps that first-time home buyers need to be thinking through. Again, if you wanna download this information in a guide that you can take notes and reference it later, you can go to yourfinancialpharmacist.com/home guide. That's one word. Nate, talk to us about the real estate, RPH home buying concierge service that you offer and how pharmacists, no matter where they are in the country, could benefit from working with you. Tell us about what that service entails and where they can go to find more.
Yeah, absolutely. So we alluded to this service a little bit earlier, but the idea was that, years ago when I bought my first house, I wanted to have a great real estate agent on my team and didn't really know how to get that
Mhm.
person, right? I knew how to ask a couple of friends who they used and whatever. I knew how to Google good real estate agent in my area, but like that was it, right? So we wanted to try to create a service that kind of filled that gap. And so we did that. It's a totally free service available through our website. You can go to realestaterph.com. There's the home buying concierge service right there. It starts with a 30-minute call with me. It's totally free. We're going to chat about things like budget, must-haves. We're going to go through loan options, answer any questions you have. And then after that conversation, we're going to connect you with a really great real estate agent that's going to be specific to you guys in the area that you're looking in. Somebody that we've vetted or that we've worked with in the past through like an interview process, or again, that's actually helped another pharmacist buy a home. And then once you get connected, you get off and running with them. So it's a nice way to take the guesswork out of it and not have to
Mhm.
do any of the legwork of interviewing these agents and trying to find the right one when you're just trying to make ends meet and get through the day sometimes. So that's why the service exists. It's there to really be a helpful thing for pharmacists.
So again, realestaterph.com. You get more information. We'll link to that in the show notes. You can book a call with Nate. Nate, if I'm listening and I've got a distant thought of, hey, I'm going to buy in the next maybe year or 2 years versus I'm listening and, I'm ready to go right now. Like, when would you advise people to begin this process and working with you?
Yeah, great question. So if you're in that 6+ months out range, that's probably the time to be focused on budget, focused on all the things we talked about in the kind of the guide, the first couple steps to get ready for those things. Once you reach that, hey, we would reasonably buy a house 6 months from now or sooner. That's probably when it's time to engage with
Mm,
me. All the way up until, hey, we've already gone to a couple open houses, Nate. Like, we're ready to look at this place. I've even had people engage the service knowing the property they wanted to put an offer on, right? They're like, "Hey,
mhm.
Nate, we found the perfect place. Like, can you help?" And we can help that quickly. So anything 6 months and before is probably a good time to connect with me. If you've got longer, it's probably time to keep working on that budget, make sure everything's all your ducks are in a row, and then get closer and engage me at that point.
The only asterisk I would add there is know thyself, right? So it's very easy. I remember this myself, where it's, hey, we're looking in 1 year, and then you start searching, and it's like we're looking tomorrow,
Yep,
right? So,
easy to do.
just thinking about that timeline, thinking about the budget, and really using that point in time, as you mentioned, if you're 6 months out, to really look at the rest of the financial plan and the pieces to figure out how this is going to fit in to that as well. Nate, as always, great stuff. Appreciate your insights. Love the way you teach us up to date information that you're bringing to our community. Thanks so much for taking time.
Thanks for having me.
Nate and I have covered a ton of information in this podcast. So imagine working with Nate one on one through your home buying journey and having his support to give you much needed peace of mind. We know many pharmacists want to feel confident about big financial decisions, including a home purchase. So if you have fears of being house poor or concerns about the impact a home purchase might have on your other financial goals, Nate and his home buying concierge service can help, all at no cost to you. You can visit realestaterph.com or click on the link in the show notes to schedule your free 30-minute jumpstart planning session with Nate. As we conclude this week's podcast, an important reminder that the content on this show is provided to you for informational purposes only and is not intended to provide and should not be relied on for investment or any other advice. Information in the podcast and corresponding materials should not be construed as a solicitation or offer to buy or sell any investment or related financial products. We urge listeners to consult with a financial advisor with respect to any investment. Furthermore, the information contained in our archived newsletters, blog posts, and podcasts is not updated and may not be accurate at the time you listen to it on the podcast. Opinions and analyses expressed herein are solely those of your financial pharmacist unless otherwise noted and constitute judgments as of the dates published. Such information may contain forward-looking statements which are not intended to be guarantees of future events. Actual results could differ materially from those anticipated in the forward-looking statements. For more information, please visit yourfinancialpharmacist.com/disclaimer. Thank you again for your support of the Your Financial Pharmacist podcast. Have a great rest of your week.